Good afternoon. I'm Javier Urcid. I'm an associate professor of anthropology at Brandeis University in Waltham, Massachusetts. I want to begin by thanking the director, Mr. Chung, and Professor John, as well as Dr. Ko, for making it possible for me to be here, and for their warmth and special hospitality. As I will be going through my remarks, Dr. Ko will be generous enough to be presenting in the background sections of the journal's website so that you can have an idea of the way in which the journal is trying to reach globally its audience. I'm honored to represent Brandeis University's Department of Anthropology at this gathering of scholars and students at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. My presence here today can also be taken as a representation of the 7 members of the International Editorial Board of Science and Society. And in particular, I am pleased to be able to represent my Brandeis colleague, Professor Richard Parmentier, the editor-in-chief of our journal, who sends his warmest greetings and whose words I will represent today. It would seem that there is a lot of representation going on. In fact, representation lies at the heart of the sign processes or semioses that are the focus of the multidisciplinary research published in Science and Society. Two somewhat contradictory meanings of representation have been widely recognized. First, for one thing to represent another is for it to stand for or in place of something that is absent or unknowable, as a political representative does for a constituency. Second, to represent can mean to re-present, that is, to make something present once again that was once absent, as a statue does for a deer. A third colloquial meaning that has developed in the past few decades involves the empathetic utterance of the quasi-verb represent, to mean that the speaker affirms his or her existential solidarity and authentic stance with respect to some issue. It is no doubt because of these multiple meanings that a group of distinguished scholars at the University of California at Berkeley call their journal simply Representations. In contrast, Science and Society is based on the working notion that these basic standing for and representing relationships need to be placed in at least 5 additional contexts. The codification or organization of science into complex structures, the communication of science across various transmission media, the fixing or inscription of science in relatively permanent textual or material forms, the modalities of interpretation available to or prohibited for signed interpreters, and powerful restrictive or regimenting forces that specify or delimit meaning-making in all of these embedded contexts. So, following the lead of your own Semiosis Research Center, the journal is devoted to the study of sign processes or semioses in all its manifestations. But in the announcement of our intention to investigate the multi-layered relationships among representation, codification, communication, interpretation, inscription, and regimentation, we are only suggesting these 6 levels as heuristic or even provisional guides for research. It was then a remarkably appropriate example of semiosis when Professor Ko initially contacted Professor Parmentier by mail using the Code of English on April 26, 2012, to discuss the prospects of scholarly collaboration with Brandeis University. We too had for a number of years, though in a much less formal manner, established a discussion circle we called the Symbolic Form Study Group. And in our sessions over the years, we explored the nature of symbolic forms in fields such as linguistic anthropology, anthropological archaeology, comparative literature, classical studies, and art history, with the help of a number of distinguished visitors such as Gregory Nagy, Irene Portis-Winner, and Irene Winter. But it was not until we joined forces with Hankuk University's Semiosis Research Center in 2012 that we all became truly symbolic in the etymological sense of the word. The English word symbol is based on the classical Greek word symbolon, which literally means thrown together. It was originally used to describe two things, once part of a unity, broken apart, and then reassembled to constitute a unity again. Thus, the reuniting of two pieces torn from the same piece of paper or two fragments of pottery could be a pledge or symbolon for the persons holding them. Taken more broadly, symbolon came to stand for an agreement involving more than one party. Thus, a conventional arrangement as distinct from one occurring naturally. Note that the sense of symbol as figurative, non-literal, hidden, or mystical meaning is a later derived or secondary meaning. So in coming halfway around the world to be with you today, I'm not only a mutable representation, but more importantly, I'm one half of a symbol that has finally come back to regain its conventional unity, namely the agreement between our two universities to produce science and society. What are some implications of the title of our journal, Science and Society? First of all, in this title we can hear distinct echoes of the famous words from the Swiss linguist Ferdinand de Saussure, lecturing in Geneva at the turn of the 20th century, that a new science is imaginable, a science that does not yet exist, but whose place is already reserved, that studies science at the heart of society. Saussure had in mind the relationship between various systems of codified symbols, material, gestural, pictorial, linguistic, that fuse a plane of expressive form with a plane of meaningful content. And in a brilliant but frequently misunderstood move, Saussure showed that rather than assuming that the signifying properties of these socially embedded codes derived essentially from human language, the more productive insight is to see in language features of these other codes, especially their motivation. Motivation, or more precisely relative motivation, describes some kind of rationale, connection, or externality, to use the economist's term, between the expressive plane and the content plane. In other words, some limitations on arbitrariness. Saussure rallied against the illusion perpetrated by some philosophers that an isolated word can be adequately understood as an arbitrary hookup between a sound segment and a conceptual segment, a relationship he termed signification. Rather, and this brings us back to the "and society" of our journal's title, Saussure realized that science never appear as isolated entities, but as part of complex systems, including groupings of co-occurring signs, what he called syntagms, the sequence of dishes in a fancy meal, for example, and virtual associative sets, what he called paradigms, the classical orders in architecture, for example. Saussure labeled the positional contribution that these syntagms and paradigms make to the meaning of individual signs their value. A better translation would be balance, alluding to the technical term in chemistry. And so it is these complexes that provide the systemic motivation for both language and non-linguistic signs of all kinds. What is remarkable about language is that the relative arbitrariness of signification that is, the absence of any necessary link between linguistic expression and linguistic meaning, makes possible the perfectly massive contribution of systemic or code-driven motivation, since nothing stands in its way, which in turn means the diachronic and cross-cultural stability of signification itself. So for Saussure, symbolic codes are socially shared, and more to the point, Saussure never began the hard work of classifying or typologizing the relative motivation he so prophetically proclaimed. For this, we need to cross the Atlantic Ocean and bring into the discussion the American scientist and philosopher Charles S. Peirce, who called himself a backwoodsman in the study of science and symbols. Peirce's largely unpublished writings on semiotic, that is, the science of science, predates Saussure's speculations on semiology by a couple of decades. Both scholars lived relatively reclusive lives. Saussure confined to the upper floor of his family palatial home in Geneva, and Peirce hiding from bill collectors in a large farmhouse named Arisby in Milford, Pennsylvania. As a result, the founder of semiotics, to use the modern term first proposed by the anthropologist Margaret Mead in 1962, and the founder of semiology never heard of each other. Although, as I will try to demonstrate, the work can be viewed as an example of unintended complementary distribution. Peirce's great insight was to realize that in addition to investigating the nature of signification, signs and symbols taken in isolation, and the nature of codes, the rules governing real or virtual complexes of signs, we need to add into the mix the interpreters of signs. Not necessarily a physical person, but some dynamic optic, outcome, or effect signs have when viewed from the perspective of their processual deployment. This process he termed semiosis, and in assuming the name Semiosis Research Center, my colleagues at Hankuk University had fittingly honored that homage. It was, by the way, St. Augustine, writing at the end of the 4th century, who first proposed the inclusion of the interpreter, a reader of scripture or a listener to Augustine's sermons, in the study of science. But Peirce thought that any account of meaning that could include both laboratory-based scientific research and logically precise philosophical reasoning must recognize that for both of these truth-driven enterprises, interpreters or interpretants, the technical term he invented, cannot be completely free to arrive at conclusions unconnected to the path stipulated or determined by the deployed signs, that is, by the necessary semiosis of either experimental science or syllogistic reasoning. So, on the assumption that everyone is a truth seeker, signs and their objects must have definable or typologizable kinds of relationships, and their interpretants must form a representation of the same kinds of relationships that pertain between signs and their objects. And this is where we find Peirce's most used and overused distinction between sign relations based on formal resemblance or icons, relations based on physical contiguity or indices, and relations based on arbitrary conventions or symbols. A painted portrait as an icon resembles the person depicted. A stop sign as an index at the side of the road tells us exactly where to stop the car. And the word semiosis as a symbol only exists because a community of speakers agrees on the range of its semantic meaning. But now notice that by assuming a commitment to truth, Peirce has actually uncovered the logical organization of Saussure's motivation. A keen scholar of classical and medieval writings on these matters, Peirce's triple division or trichotomy of sign-to-object relations roughly lines up with a more standard dual division between motivated signs, comprising icons and indices, and unmotivated symbols. Unfortunately, the word symbole in Saussure's French is equivalent to Peirce's English sign, and Peirce's English term symbol lines up with Saussure's French signet. Not complementary distribution, but complementary confusion. And here I finally come to the point of this discussion of Saussure and Peirce. In insisting on sign processes or semiosis as an essentially logical affair, Peirce necessarily abandoned the and society dimension that was precisely the key to Saussure's fundamental discovery of the socio-historical grounding of symbolic codes. Correlatively, without the constraints of the objective determination of interpreters and their interpretants through the mediational operation of signs as determined by their objects, Saussure could not come up with an adequate account of how signs and symbols function in real-time events and interactions, a realm he dismissed as utterly irrelevant to his semiology. And this then is the motivation for our journal. The science of signs at the heart of society may have been proclaimed in advance and explored by a brilliant backwoodsman on both sides of the Atlantic. But the real work of scholarship lies ahead in the pages of Science and Society, the inscribed textual symbol of a collaborative relationship crossing the even wider Pacific Ocean. Thank you.